Okay, this afternoon, we are moving down to the third phase of the program. We have 3 speakers this afternoon in the first session. We have, first of all, Brinda Sarathy from Pitzer, who will be reading a paper whose title is Solution or Sinkhole, and it goes on and on after that. My papers always have long titles too, so I understand. Then Heather Williams is returning for a second session about California water. And finally, Henry Barbosa, who wanted me to mention that in his description in the program, it should also say that he got his start on water issues by being a member of the Three Valleys Water District. And that's how he got on the Metropolitan Water Board. Okay, so once again, the speakers are going to take 20 minutes, and after that, after they are all finished, there will be a question and answer session with microphones held and distributed to people in the audience. The program should be over at what time? 3 o'clock. 15-minute break then before the next one. So we will get started now. Brinda, it's all yours.
All right. And I blame Andy for the long title. I only wanted to do an intro to the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, but of course it was in the context of California water policy. So thank you for having me here today. We've already learned a lot about global water concerns in the face of climate change and other stressors, and national level policy approaches that might help reorient our approach to water management in the United States. In the afternoon sessions, as already been mentioned, we'll be drilling down, and I'm not talking about fracking, to explore water issues at regional and watershed scales in our Golden State. So I want to start by outing myself. I'm not an expert in California water policy by virtue of my scholarship, but rather I've come to it through learn a tremendous amount through my teaching, and in particular my classroom pedagogy, which in my policy classes is geared towards engaging students with environmental concerns in our region. In this sense, water is literally the flow that binds, providing a course through which to more deeply understand our being here in this place right now. My talk today aims to provide a very, very simplistic overview of the BDCP. I saw that there's some documents already out there, the highlights and the quick facts, so please help yourself to those. There is, of course, the 25,000-page EIR, if you're interested in looking at that as well, and so those documents are available to you, as well as the EIS. They are a vast trove of documents to get through. So the talk is to look at the BDCP, and it's a proposal which ostensibly infuses hydraulic-era dreams with environmental values, and which represents the largest technological fix to water conveyance since the State Water Project. So this is something that Peter had mentioned earlier. So just a quick show of hands. How many of you have heard of the BDCP? So a pretty good portion of this audience, a third to 2/3. And how many of you feel like you could have an informed opinion on it versus just having heard about it? Okay, good, much fewer. And who would like to know more? Okay, great. So, presentation roadmap. Very briefly, I'm going to contextualize the Delta as a place, geographically, ecologically, and then go into a little bit of the politics, the regulatory history of it, and then what is the BDCP, apart from alphabet soup. Then CM1, looking at Conservation Measure 1, the most controversial, the most costly, so it's the tunnels. If people have heard of BDCP, they probably have heard of something about tunnels. So I'm going to specifically talk about that conservation measure, a little bit about the timing of it, and I really insisted on wanting to give this overview because we're in the heart of it. The public comment period ends April 14th of this year. So this is critical, and it's right now. A little bit about money, and then how to comment. And I think some of the people who raised their hands in terms of the informed opinion are the ones who will be the ones to answer the questions. So California Delta is a system of waterways and islands at the confluence of the San Joaquin and Sacramento rivers, and they're connected to the bay through the Carquinez Strait. Prior to the 1800s, most of the delta was a tidal wetland, of which nearly 60% was submerged by daily tides. For several months each year, the Tule marshes became a wintering ground for migratory waterfowl, including Canada geese, pintail, cinnamon teal, whistling swan, and others. In the 1800s, European settlers began farming this delta, diking and draining these previously flooded lands. In the late 1870s, John Muir would muse, in quotes, that the entire valley would one day be irrigated from end to end and carefully managed. Muir's prediction is the reality of the delta today. So the contemporary delta is largely agricultural, much of it reclaimed and protected by a series of levees. It also supplies water for over 25 million people via the CVP, the Central Valley Project, and the SWP, the State Water Project, and it's crucial habitat for land and water species unique to this ecosystem. All of this, of course, comes at a price. The 1,100 miles of levees in the delta are vulnerable to seismic activity and breaches. Land subsidence makes flooding in the delta farms and communities more likely and more devastating, with most of the delta at 5 to 25 feet below sea level. A decline in fish populations, like the endangered delta smelt, is due to a combination of increased mortality at pumping facilities, a decline in habitat and water quality, and reduced food availability due to invasive species. The delta, in addition to being the most engineered wetlands in the nation, is also highly regulated. So in a nutshell, the Central Valley Project, which I'm assuming the majority of you know about, but some of you might not, is regulated by the US Bureau of Reclamation, often just called the Bureau for short. It was built over the Depression years, and it began exporting water from the delta in 1951, with water going largely to Central Valley agriculture. The State Water Project is managed at the state level, the California Department of Water Resources, also called the DWR. And this was actually mentioned earlier by Professor Williams. She was talking about the margin by which it passed, so I just looked it up. So the Burns-Porter Act, which funded this in 1959, it passed by a margin of 174,000 votes out of a total of 5.8 million ballots cast, razor thin. And so the State Water Project began exporting large-scale water from the delta to the south via the California Aqueduct in 1972. So the other institution to keep in mind, and again, I'm trying to set a stage for a lay audience. When I first started teaching classes on water, folks didn't necessarily know what's the DWR, the water board versus the bureau. So that's kind of the institutional mapping I want to make clear. So the State Water Resources Quality Control Board, also just known as the Water Board, sets water quality standards for salinity control and protection of fish and wildlife, as well as dealing with water rights. In the late 1970s, court holdings noted that the public trust doctrine permits the board to reconsider past water allocation decisions and to amend water rights if necessary to protect fish and wildlife, and that the board's water quality role is not to protect water rights per se, but beneficial uses. So it's sort of the reasonable use doctrine. So in the midst of all that was going on with the state board in the late 1970s, there was the statewide ballot initiative in 1982 that proposed the construction of a canal to convey water directly from Northern California to Central and Southern California, bypassing the delta. So for most of this audience, you know this, you lived it. My students were not born in 1982, so I have to tell them about the peripheral canal. So the initiative was defeated 63% to 37%, with Bay Area's counties voting against the canal by more than 90% margins. So this is a moment where California voters are saying no to larger water infrastructure projects. So here's sort of the timeline. California has also experienced significant droughts, and these. So between 1987 and 1992, there was a 6-year drought that was intensifying debate over delta management. And there was a number of regulations and policies that increasingly start to focus on both water supply issues as well as ecosystem issues related to the Delta during this period. So in 1992, you have the Federal Central Valley Project Improvement Act, which reallocates a portion of CVP water to benefit fisheries and the ecosystem. And this is a significant departure from the way CVP water had been allocated in the past. And it's interesting to know that some of these restoration projects are currently in peril just given the state of the current drought and the needs of California agriculture. A number of other initiatives have also played out in the Delta, including partnerships between state and federal agencies under the umbrella of CalFed. And I know we have a member, at least one member in our audience, who is part of the strategic plan developed under the rubric of the Delta Vision Project, the Blue Ribbon Task Force set up by Governor Schwarzenegger, which ultimately came out to articulate 12 recommendations, the first of which was that the ecosystem and a reliable water supply are the primary co-equal goals for sustainable management of the Delta. And so this is coming out in 2008, these recommendations. And in 2009, of course, we have the state legislature passing the Delta Reform Act. It's also sometimes called the Water Package, which provides a framework to achieve these co-equal goals of providing a more reliable water supply to California and restoring and enhancing the Delta ecosystem. And so this slide is just briefly depicting the various institutions created as part of this act, including the Delta Stewardship Council, which is charged with creating a more comprehensive management plan for the whole Delta, which is the Delta Plan, and then there's like different institutions giving various charges. So I'm looking specifically at the Department of Water Resources charge, who is in charge of developing the conservation plan, the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. What's also interesting to look at is the state board that I had talked about, the water board. They are going to be coming up with new flow criteria for the rivers, for the Delta. So now kind of going down even further and scaling down, what exactly is the BDCP? So essentially, it's a 50-year habitat conservation plan that's being prepared as a natural community conservation plan under California legislation, the California Natural Communities Conservation Planning Act, and the state's endangered species regulation, as well as a habitat conservation plan under the federal ESA. And so it's a more holistic or ecosystem-oriented approach to conservation planning. In the sense, it's a departure from sort of trying to save a single species under the ESA, like a triage approach that's often been critiqued. The ESA has been critiqued for just trying to save a single species, which is often too little, too late. The BDCP is made up of specific actions called conservation measures. So it includes 22 conservation measures aimed at improving a range of things, including water operations, protecting water supplies and water quality, and restoring the Delta ecosystem within a stable regulatory framework. So it's also to help folks who depend on this water in terms of their planning and use of water. And the conservation plan itself is aimed at 56 fish and terrestrial species, their habitats, and the ecosystem. So it's really scaled. It's looking at landscape level effects, it's looking at individual species, and it's looking at natural communities, and then to individual species. In terms of how it's being implemented, sort of the Delta, this is actually from the documents, the BDCP highlights piece, so there's a lot more information in those reports, but they've divided it up into conservation zones based on the distribution of physical and biological conditions. And again, it's a natural community-based approach, which allows for achieving multiple habitat objectives on the same land base. Okay. So now CM1, Conservation Measure 1, is the water, it relates to water facilities and operations. And so basically, since it was first proposed, this is what it is now, okay? It makes up of 3 intakes in the northern part of the Delta, new intakes for water. There'll be 2 subterranean tunnels with a total capacity of 9,000 CFS, cubic feet per second. And they're going to, there's an alignment shift away. So each of the tunnels is 30 miles in length, and I said the CFS already. It's interesting to, this is different from what was originally proposed. Originally, 5 tunnels were proposed for 15,000 CFS capacity, and things got moved partly because of political resistance in the Delta communities themselves. And so there's been an alignment shift of these tunnels away from these communities to become more so on public land, so where the tunnels are going to go. And so a picture, this was the only graphic I could find quickly on the proposed route of the tunnels. And so there would be a new forebay at the intake up near Freeport, south of Freeport. And then that would be going underground and then using the existing aqueduct infrastructure we have to channel water. And so the existing southern delta pumps can cause or increase reversal in river flows, which potentially alter salmon migratory patterns and decline of sensitive fish like the smelt. So the argument is relocating the main point of diversion to the northern delta and establishing new operating criteria would improve east-west delta flow and water volume, among other things. And overall, the claim of the BDCP is that it would improve native fish, migratory patterns, and habitat conditions, while also allowing for greater operational flexibility, so thus helping with supply reliability. So in this graph, we can see how operations of the North Delta diversions are subject to specific year-round criteria, okay? And this is again from the highlights document. Namely average river flows, and they're aimed at minimizing impacts on fish and meeting water quality standards. So operations here are fundamentally tied to hydrologic conditions, and thus variation in supply is almost a given if you assume there's going to be variability in flow. So of note here, okay, so in short, there must always be a minimum Sacramento River flow before water could be diverted through the tunnels. And that there is the maximum possible diversion is 9,000 cubic feet per second. And that's reached at river flows of about 30,500 CFS. So any type of reduced river flow would lead to significant reductions in the volume of diversion, with no diversion at river flows at or below 5,000 CFS. And so you can see that on the last bar. And the DWR, so this is a presentation of what they're giving in the documents, and I'm sort of trying to give some interpretation or couching of it. So the DWR has classified water year types, right, by wet, below normal or dry, and critical. So 3 water year types. That's I don't know if you can all see that, but those are the numbers to the right. So as you all probably know, we're right now in a critical year with almost I think it's a 0% allocation to CVP contractors. So what's going to also be key here is the frequency of water type years over time. So note that the data above only depicts frequency of the Sacramento River flows between 1949 and 2009, with 53% noted for wet years, 34% for below normal or dry, and then 13% for critical. So one of the questions to ask, especially in light of the morning sessions, is what happens as this frequency changes? What if the ratio of critical to wet or above normal years radically alters in the face of climate change? Will critical water years become the new normal? If so, we are talking about significantly reduced diversion volumes, right? And so potentially, I'm not saying this will be the case, but one could argue it's a tunnel for a trickle. So here is, this is actually, and I apologize for not putting in the sources of the slides. I'll correct that, and I can upload a new version of this. This is actually from the San Diego Water Authority's page. It's an infographic, but just giving you a sense of where we are in the BDCP process schedule. And so, like I said, the public comment period on these documents ends mid-April. And so they're potentially going to be certified by the end of 2014. And so based on when they get, first of all, they have to be approved, and then the BDCP doesn't need any other authorization, right? You could have certified environmental documents But it all depends on the funding, whether this project can actually be implemented. And of course, I will talk about that. In terms of the implementation schedule, the BDCP seeks to restore and protect more than 150,000 acres of habitat over its 50-year permit duration. And this graph, again taken from the highlights document, demonstrates the proposed sequencing of the implementation of habitat protection and restoration in the BDCP. Conservation measures that address water operations and other stressors will be implemented beginning soon after permit issuance. And basically, according to this, operations could begin as early as year 11, right, after the completion of construction of the conveyance facility. So now here's the question on everyone's mind, money, cost. So the total estimated cost, according to the DWR documents, of implementing the BDCP over the 50-year permit is about $24.75. So let's just say $25 billion, and that's an undiscounted 2012 dollars. The capital costs for the 50-year permit term is about $20 billion. And the majority of these costs, right, are associated with the construction of those intakes and conveyance facilities. Okay, and this is estimated operations and maintenance costs, which together come to about $4.9 billion. And I won't break that down for you further, you can read it. And I'm also short on time. And then, now for the billion-dollar question, right, funding. The BDCP, and this is different from what Peter had said earlier, we have moved away from a subsidized kind of thing to it's a beneficiaries pay principle in the BDCP, meaning that the cost, the vast majority of the cost, will be borne by those who receive the benefit, at least in the proposal, okay? The beneficiaries of the BDCP water conveyance facilities included certain municipal, industrial, and agricultural users served by the state and state water project and the CVP. Participating state and federal water contractors are asked to contribute approximately $17 billion, or 68% of the total funding. Okay. However, habitat restoration is also considered to provide a broad public value. Okay, so accordingly, the DWR expects partial funding by a variety of state and federal sources. So initial state funding may come from 2 future water bonds, including the water bond approved by the California State Legislature in 2009 for the statewide ballot. This, as all of you know, was postponed until November of this year. And the legislature is in the process of considering amendments to the bond. So the current estimate for state funding of the BDCP over the 50-year permit in terms, state funding is about $4 billion, or 17% of the total project costs. So I am perfectly timed here. At the end of the day, right, it's critical to understand that the BDCP is far from a done deal. I want to note, because when I came to Southern California and started hearing about this issue and learning about it, to me, in the media, it sounded like it was a done deal. And when I started scratching the surface, it's far from that. The only certainty in this is variability. So given climate change's impact on altered hydrologic conditions, including river flows, the plan outlines how diversions ultimately are tied to variable water supplies. This is meant to provide water users with a way in which to plan for the future and to also provide a stable regulatory framework. But it also raises the second issue, and that's that of feasibility. How feasible are the water supply benefits? Is it worth the cost to beneficiaries versus something like investing massively in efficiency or water conservation? Okay, and again, I go back to this thing. Are they going to be investing in tunnels that only provide potentially a trickle, and maybe that's just too provocative, but much less water than they had originally expected? Moreover, we already know that the original $11 billion bond measure is not going to pass in the state legislature. So other water bonds are currently being proposed. Many Northern California senators are pushing for a bond to fund restoration outside of the BDCP. So most recently, there was an almost $7 billion water bond towards, and the title of it was Safe Drinking Water, Water Quality, and Water Supply. That's being sponsored by Senator Lois Wolk out of Solano, and that's already gone through 3 policy committees in Sacramento, and that's actually not going towards BDCP stuff at all. So thus, although the BDCP may get environmental clearance and certified documents, there is a real chance that there will be a shortage of state funds. Who will foot the shortfall? The beneficiaries? Goes back to the question of feasibility. And of course, this is in the larger arena of resistance. So you're going to have environmental groups and you're going to have litigation, quite likely. So the last assumption of this project in the documents is this will be passed because past large projects have gone through. But I want to note that the last major hydraulic era project in California to go through was the State Water Project, and the peripheral canal was defeated after that. So something to think about and pay attention to. And there's a link on how to comment. You have a month and a half left to do so. Thank you.
Next on the program, second speaker for this session will be Heather Williams.
Well, thank you again for having me again. I hope you're not getting tired of hearing me talk. You know, it's long been the case that people who come here from elsewhere, like me, they've taken in the gentle Pacific breezes, the ocean sunsets, the panoramic vistas, the sunshine, and the mild winter temperatures, have mistaken the easy climate and the beauty of the place for an easy living. For those who actually pick up stakes and move out here, that illusion is often shattered pretty quickly. For current transplants, it comes in terms of high costs of living, of ceaseless traffic, of bad air, and a dodgy job market. For those who come from outside its borders, outside the country's borders, there may be the reality of violent policing, of pestilent living quarters and corrupt landlords, of wages far below what they legally should be. For migrants in the last century, it came in the form of wild competition and speculation over the state's natural resources. We all learn in school about the gold rush. Even in Kansas, we learned about it, and the violence and the mayhem that accompanied it. But in fact, looking back, the more consequential competition in the state was not over its gold claims or even over its golden lands, but in fact over its scarce, sweet, clear, fresh water. The title of my talk, The Elusive Quest for Water Reform in California, refers to a great conundrum in this lovely but hard place we live in. Virtually every person in the state who knows anything about water would tell you that reform would do the state a good deal of good, that we should use water better, with less energy expenditure, with fewer wastes pouring into waterways, more stormwater capture and use, that we should cease the lunacy of growing cotton or alfalfa in the middle of the desert, or putting in massive subdivisions of single-family homes and lawns over stressed aquifers that may even yet lack court-supervised plans for sustainable takeouts, that we should ensure a real human right to clean water for the very farm workers who toil all day in irrigated orchards to provide luxury produce to our stores. But keep talking to these people, and they will tell you that no matter how obvious these problems are, and how common sense it may seem to overhaul current arrangements and institute a sweeping water reform in California, that it's unlikely to happen. I shall argue that the elusive quest for water reform in California is not due to an inability of our leaders to see the future. They see increasing population and decreasing sources of water, but instead it has to do with the hidden weight of the past. So in the following comments, I want to contend that many of the water arrangements in California, as ludicrous as they may seem, are going to be remarkably difficult to alter at a system level, because they reflect a history of competing and often mutually incompatible uses of water that have been locked in with a breathtakingly large number of local compromises and sealed in place with a set of now, at least in the medium-term future, irreversible interregional water transfers. So At a distance, while California's water governance seems to have some heft and some sense and actually a fair amount of money that people are willing to put behind it, we have a standard for water use written into our 1879 Constitution, Article 10, reasonable and beneficial use. We actually have outlawed water waste, but defining that sometimes is difficult. We have a state water board that has power over allocation. We have regional water quality boards that have power over dischargers and water quality. We have utilities that are appropriators or people who have entities that have water rights who treat our urban water and send it to us. But when you look at it more closely, it's actually extraordinarily fragmented. It's like putting on a pair of reader glasses and suddenly seeing all the things you've been missing once you, like me, get to your mid-40s. There are, in fact, a tremendous number of entities, public and private, that have some say over rights to water and water courses, who deal with some aspect of allocation, of transfers, of treatment, of storage, of pumping, of power generation, of banking, and conveyance. Some counts put that number somewhere around 16,000. The call for water reform in California isn't new. In fact, I would contend that the need for water reform came almost as soon as people began to till the soil in Alta California as their main source of getting food and a livelihood here. Mission authorities weighed in on use rights, so did the Viceroy under the Spanish. Then, under Mexican rule, ranch grants that were given by the Mexican government carefully assigned to grantees the use of certain bodies of water along with responsibilities for the maintenance of the zanjas or the conveyance or the canals. But it was certainly after Anglo rule in 1848 began that detonated the first series of water crises and the first real need for broad-scale state water reform. Mining, irrigation, and intensive cattle raising were three industries that were bound to clash in struggles over water. Cattle ranchers, of course, wanted to use the streams and rivers that flowed through their lands and to put their cattle to graze on the meadows beside them. Miners, meanwhile, wanted the right to channel water from those same streams to rivers in places where they were scraping gold from the dirt. They needed the water to process the ore, and then later they would need enormous amounts of water to blast away entire hillsides with what they called hydraulicking. And then, of course, they needed the rivers to carry all of that sediment-filled, dirty waste away. And then downstream, you had irrigators who wanted to convey waters, and hopefully in pretty good condition, from streams and rivers to dry lands for orchards and vineyards and row crops. Now, the California legislature in 1850 and 51 was little more at the time than adventurers, miners, irrigators, and ranchers themselves, and they managed to create the first great failure of government when they passed not just one, but two unifying frameworks for allocating water, which directly contradicted each other. And the legislature passed a riparian law, which of course gave rights to the ranchers who wanted rights to the water running through their land. But they also passed a doctrine of appropriation, a law of appropriation, which enabled people to own water rights and to convey water from the channel to some other place. And they, by the way, left these two doctrines in place and asked the courts to sort it out. With uncertainties surrounding a scarce and valuable commodity, water, an epic race for the rivers was unleashed. During the latter half of the 19th century, an extraordinary intensification of these land and water uses, grazing, mining, and irrigation, would make it clear that the state simply could not be governed with all three and without some water reform. Cattle, for example, had multiplied by the mid-1860s to 3 million grazing animals reliant on grasslands and marshes, of which I've estimated they had access to about 20 million acres available. That's a lot of land, but each animal needed up to 70 acres a year in a sustainable system. So do the math, and you can imagine how quickly California was being grazed to the ground, with attendant erosion of lands, of riverbanks, flood damage, and decimation of ecosystems. Irrigated agriculture, meanwhile, went from a few thousand acres in the 1850s to over 1.4 million acres, a number that would actually rise to over 7 million by the mid-20th century. And this, in many cases, was sucking streams dry and also aquifers, especially after the arrival of gasoline-powered pumps in the 1890s and early 1900s. And as bad as all that was, and as conflict-ridden as all that was, mining, particularly the hydraulicking, was fast destroying California's waterways as early as the 1860s and 70s. The scars of this industry still mark the riverbanks today, and we still have big problems with mercury tailings in many of our watersheds and in the Delta. In one of the country's early environmental rulings by a high court, our own naughty Ninth Federal Circuit Court, often accused of terrible liberal practices, put a stop to the practice of hydraulicking in 1884 in one of the most, I think, one of the best rulings they ever did for our state. Now, this federal ruling was important, but a lot of what else happened in those years of rapid-fire expansion of land use happened without much effective government oversight of water. What got built was built with private money, and the claims that were made to water rights were done usually through claims of prior use, i.e. the first to be using the river and continually using it. And conflicts, of which there were many, were solved at best through costly litigation, which usually limited contestation to those who could actually afford to be in court and hire lawyers, sometimes for cases that would last over a decade. Now, add to all of this, this conflict, many of the other uses to which rivers and surface waters were being put. Fishing was huge. I mean, look at the number of canneries in the Delta and on the Sacramento River. Navigation, hunting, gathering. There was also hydropower, domestic water service for cities and for towns. Now, I bring up all this seemingly ancient history because it actually matters a lot to what is and is not possible today in terms of water reform. There were reforms that were enacted, to be sure. Water was made a public trust, and we established this standard of reasonable and beneficial use for water. And actually, we are at the century mark of the Water Commission Act of 1914, which gave ostensible rights to allocation to the state government. And we saw a proliferation of water-related agencies at federal, state, and regional levels, particularly as Peter Glick was pointing out. But much of this water state was not put in place to erase and rebuild everything that had come beforehand, but instead it was layered on top of many thousands of already existing arrangements, and importantly, many already existing and very strong claims to water rights, to allocation rights, to appropriation rights. The water state that emerged had a really special charge. It needed first to facilitate economic growth and population expansion by using technology and, where necessary, regulation to overcome obstacles presented by the relative scarcity of water. Second, it needed to move water from where it was abundant to where populations were growing, no matter where that was. And then third, the water state needed to work around already established water rights of a host of early 19th and 20th century appropriators, even where their activities had overtaxed the capacity of surface waters and basins to supply their activities. So really, we saw this stair-step reconfiguration of California's waterways, serving these very goals. The Central Valley Project, a federal project in the 1930s, or beginning in the 1930s, was meant to compensate for the rapid depletion of aquifers in the San Joaquin Valley. The Los Angeles Aqueduct, Parker Dam, and the Colorado River Aqueduct were brought into being to accommodate and encourage growth in Southern California, which was booming mostly from real estate sales and later from industrial pursuits. And of course, the State Water Project was installed to make up for God's mistake. There's a quote that I couldn't find, but it's Harvey Banks, who was the first chair of the Department of Water Resources in the 1950s, said at one point to citizen groups in Southern California that God had made this beautiful state and he had made just one mistake. He put all the water where the people weren't. And so I guess he saw it as his role to make up for what God hadn't done correctly. So the ideology of water agencies as the handmaids to growth was put in place by a state that gave water agencies a charge of protecting water supplies, even later, especially with reforms in the 60s and the early 70s, even balancing uses. But ultimately, they gave them very, very little power to participate in land use planning. So water agencies, as skilled as many of them are, and I am absolutely stunned by the technical skill of our water agencies here in Southern California, are ultimately having to be problem solvers after the fact. Their charge is now and always has been, given unlimited growth, what is the least bad option for California? So then they're left oftentimes to help figure out, how do we stop the loss of fisheries and wetlands to agribusiness or to exploding water markets in the big cities? How do we stop the overdraft of groundwater supplies and basins that have not been adjudicated by the courts? What do we do about the seismic hazard looming over the state's delta conveyance system? How do we deal with the toxic legacy of the state's mining, manufacturing, agribusiness, and military industries that have left plumes of contamination in surface and groundwaters? How do we deal with questions of reasonable and beneficial use when looking at clashes between different kinds of legitimate uses? Say, agriculture for the country's produce markets and water for new homes, or recreation areas that are needed for quality of life. How do we deal with perverse incentives for overuse of water in certain places that are built into the idea of continuous use as the standard for a water right? Can a state government charged with facilitating growth and respecting longtime users and moving water from where it's plentiful to where people are living actually achieve water reform for a hotter, drier 21st century? Well, my answer is, at present, no. And I don't mean that in any apocalyptic sense, but I mean it in the most honest way of saying that there's no great solution imminent for the California water state. Absent a water czar and a revolution, I predict that California, in some senses, will have to muddle through. As acrimonious as water battles are in the larger sense, our experience in living with conflict and abiding by court orders and by statutes is pretty good. Some of it will just be settled by weather and location and the luck of individual water districts. Some of it may be a little bit funny when extravagant new golf courses just dry up and go back to being desert. Some of it will be anguishing as farm workers without work are left to seek livelihoods in even more marginal pursuits, if that is possible. And some of it will just be technical and expensive, like the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, as we turn to more recycling, more stormwater capture, more bond levies, and yes, more taxes. But what can be said is that in an environment where comprehensive solutions are impossible to forge at top levels, at least now, the creativity and informed action at local and regional levels is likely to become all the more important. And where people can avoid costly litigation and seek platforms for multiple and mutually compatible uses, such as restored wetlands that provide open space, habitat, recreation, and water filtration, or tax codes that incentivize the conversion of lawns to native drought-tolerant plants, or flood control structures that provide filtration, natural banks, and shade cover of cottonwood and alders. There are low-lying fruit to be harvested. And where solutions can be replicated and or adapted to new places and situations, it may be that grander alliances capable of taking on bigger issues and bigger users, including things like cotton fiefdoms in the Central Valley, and pressuring for things like the reduction of commodity payments and better use of water, then we may actually start to see an incremental change in the water landscape of our state. So if my conclusions are a little bit depressing, I apologize. If they're incorrect, I'm delighted. And I wanted to thank you again for the invitation to participate in this wonderful conference.
The final paper for this session on California water will be by Henry Barbosa. Henry prefers to deliver it sitting there, so I will let him go right ahead with that mic there.
To begin with, this presentation is aimed at the beginner or amateur and is non-technical in nature. I hope to make simple a very complex business without being simplistic about it. This presentation is drawn from my own personal experience as I plunged into and tried to understand what was going on once I got elected to the Three Valleys Water Board in 1992. Prior to that time, I had 20 years' experience as a city attorney, and I thought I knew it all. You're right, it deserves a laugh. I plunged into this and struggled with it for a very long time. What I plan to do in my short time here is I'm going to talk briefly about the legal history and a short overview. You've heard some comments already. I'm going to secondly move on and make a few comments about my own observations about the cultural differences between the North and South and why it has always been so difficult to come to agreement on anything involving water. Then I'm going to move to a third part and talk briefly about the existing infrastructure in Southern California, and then offer my personal comments and observations about what we have built here. Finally, I'll very quickly get to the closing remarks and make a few suggestions about where we go in the near future. So with that outline, let me jump into the first part, the legal history of California law. And I apologize, I have to read this to you, but I wrote it. California water law reflects a very curious amalgam of common law and civil law sources for the protection of primarily private property interests. It has been described as a grab-bag body of law based in part on Roman civil law, Germanic mining law, Spanish land grant law, and English common law. Most influential, of course, has been the English common law in particular. And English common law, is predicated on the notion of property, which is at the core of English society. As you recall and should know, Great Britain has no single core organic instrument, such as a constitution or a Bill of Rights, as in the American system. The American system is relatively unique in that it places a premium on personal individual integrity without regard to any claim to property or class. And this difference sets the table for conflict between these two polar opposites. On the one side, the common law, what I call property perspective, versus the general welfare regardless of class or property, and I call that the personal perspective. Beginning in the 1850s, after California was joined to the U.S. Republic, there evolved a traditional and somewhat inconsistent legal foundation resulting in a confusing body of terms and definitions of interests in water and land, riparian rights attached to land by virtue of being adjacent to a stream or a waterway, appropriative rights by overliers not next to a river, priorities to access by virtue of being first or earlier in time, and without any particular consideration of the social utility of the water-dependent enterprise, whatever the holder of the right determined in his or her own individual interest. These competing theories evolved between the individual's right to certain water and the greater needs of a growing society and changing circumstances and hydrological conditions, the property perspective versus the personal perspective. The case law that emerged from Supreme Court determinations began to reflect, from the primacy of individual ownership over the use of water, usufruct, which is a term from the Institutes of Emperor Justinian in the 4th century, to a position that took into account emerging social needs by relying upon a judicially created reasonable doctrine that evolved in the case law. The legal environment, however, was clouded by the adoption by the voters in 1928 of an amendment to the Constitution that added reasonable use as a constitutional mandate. That vote set up the question quite squarely, and the question is this, and we're struggling with this today. Did the voters validate the existing legal direction of evolving reasonable use? Or did the vote of the people reflect a distinct turn by inserting reasonableness into the Constitution? To lay out that dynamic, I did some search and I found an article. I'm going to read you the title of a law review article written in 1988. And the title is Changing Judicial Attitudes Towards Property Rights in California Water, from vested rights to utilitarian reallocations, written by two scholars in the Pacific Law Journal, McGeorge School of Law, 1988. And I want to quote from the Law Review article. I think it really says it very succinctly. Quote, and the scholars, by 1926, the year of the Herminghaus decision, California law had firmly established that water rights were compensable property interest, and the courts had developed a comprehensive body of precedent defining their scope and limitations. And then it goes on and on. It picks up later on. As described previously, adoption of Article 10, Section 2 to the California Constitution, did not add the reasonableness doctrine to California law. That doctrine had been evolving for more than 50 years prior to the amendment's approval. Instead, the amendment incorporated the doctrine as it had been historically interpreted by the courts into the Constitution and extended it to competition between riparians and appropriators. And it goes on. In 4 landmark decisions since 1967, however, the courts have redefined the nature of the protectable property interest in water so as to leave no water right, riparian or appropriative, privately or publicly held, unscathed. Indeed, the courts are propelling California into a new era of judicially and administratively supervised reallocation of its water resources on the premise that water use is more a governmentally granted privilege than a privately held property right. Well, that sets a table for lots of arguments, and so you'll see why we have such conflict. It's very clear. You could argue forever about this. Well, with that conflict in mind, let me turn to the physical and cultural differences that I have observed in my time in the water world. And I'm repeating things that were said by others, but I prepared my paper. In the North, historically, you've had multiple water sources available. Anyone could locate near a stream or a river and tap right in. The region was blessed by the Sierra watershed. Even today, they debate the need for water meters, and very much tied to the property perspective. By contrast, in the South, there was little local water, so the search for water took on institutional momentum and looked for institutional solutions. Here in the South, water is metered, not in the North, and we live with adjudicated basins as the norm. And while the North has all these magnificent rivers you've had described, the San Joaquin, the Sacramento, and all the others shown there, the rivers in the South, the 3 major rivers, Los Angeles, San Gabriel, Santa Ana, are typically run dry year-round. And so we had to move to institutional solutions in the South. The first one to do so was, of course, the city of Los Angeles, and they took the first step and built the Owens Valley. When they created that system, everyone thought, hallelujah, water for Southern California. But that solution, paid for by Los Angeles, came with a political price. In order to get Los Angeles water, you had to be annexed into the city. And you know the reaction that brought with the surrounding cities. San Marino, Pasadena, Glendale, Burbank, San Fernando, Santa Monica, Torrance, Beverly Hills, Long Beach, Anaheim, Fullerton, Santa Ana. That's 12, I'm missing one. But the 13 cities that surrounded Los Angeles refused to accept annexation as a price of getting water. And so they formed their own organization, which became the Metropolitan Water District. And the first thing that they did, the Metropolitan Water District, was to build their own aqueduct and take it from the Colorado River. Took all that money and built a new reservoir. The second thing that Metropolitan did in the 1980s was to build Diamond Valley, a huge reservoir that was designed with the expectation that the pumps someday in the future would be turned off because of the operations of the Bay Delta. And that's exactly what has happened. Talk about a vision. In the 1980s, they were looking to the day in 2010 where the pumps were shut off, and they built this magnificent reservoir at a cost of over $2 billion, plus another $1.5 billion for the inland feeder, which is basically a huge straw. And the Diamond Valley was designed as a big gulp. It would take water when available and put all this water into the reservoir overnight in a very short period of time. This thing is beautiful and magnificent, and I'm proud of the participation I had in the decision, even though I initially debated against it. To give you an idea of the magnitude of Diamond Valley, is to tell you the capacity. It's at least 800,000 acre feet and maybe 1 million acre feet if you put it to the brim. Well, how much water is that? Imagine, I've been told, imagine a Rose Bowl in Pasadena, a Rose Bowl full of water, poured in every half hour, 24/7, for 2.5 to 3 years. That's the capacity of Diamond Valley. Another way of looking at it, I once asked the chief engineer in construction a theoretical question, because he was offended when I said, well, what if it fails? He said, Henry, it's not going to fail. But theoretically, I said, Dennis, what would happen? Well, the chief engineer took his little calculator out to tell me how much water was in Diamond Valley. He said, well, Henry, if it were ever to fail, but it won't, if it were ever to fail, it would take about 6 to 8 hours for that water to shove Camp Pendleton all the way to Catalina. He wasn't kidding. That is the magnificence of what you are paying for to have water when the pumps get shut off. Now, it is marvelous. It's a quality of life saver, but I took the view at the board, and I have historically taken a darker view of Diamond Valley. To me, it's not a monument to our greatness and our ingenuity. To me, it's a symbol and monument to the political failure to solve the problems of the Bay Delta, already described by the other speakers. You know the problem there. Instead of contributing that $3 billion to fixing the Bay Delta, we put the money into Diamond Valley. And that money is now not available to contribute to the solution to the Bay Delta. And it's the Bay Delta which is at the core of our water system for the whole state of California. My final remark, and I'll be done very quickly. I should have deferred or yielded my time to the last speakers. I found it very interesting. Now, where do we go now, and what is the future for us locally in Southern California? Well, locally, we are very fortunate to have the San Gabriel Aquifer, a magnificent structure that is here. I consider it as a huge bathtub from the mountains to the 60 freeway, from Alhambra to the other side of Pomona, is this huge, incredible aquifer created by nature. I've been told by experts that it has a potential capacity of 2 million acre feet of water, or 2 Diamond Valley reservoirs, and yet it's not utilized. It sits there, underutilized. And why? At the risk of incurring the wrath of some speakers in this audience, the reason that we have not utilized it is because the management of groundwater has been left in the hands of the property perspective crowd who have, I don't mean to be harsher, co-opted the public agencies responsible for maintaining and management of that water. In 2009, I was engaged to do a study for the Upper District to give them a strategic vision for the future, because they were looking to deliver water, and when the pumps were turned off, they could not acquire surplus water to recharge the basin. My study, presented to that board, revealed that the overdrafting of water beyond the adjudicated rights of those who were pumping it, and without the policing and requirement for replenishment or paying a charge for bringing new water into the basin, and they overdrafted repeatedly over 15 years. Cumulatively, they took out 500,000 acre feet of water, half the size of Diamond Valley, and there was not the policing or the management by the agencies locally here to correct that. Now, we suffer from multiple jurisdictions over the basin, but if there's a future for Southern California and a future for our region, it's imperative that each of you who are here and care about the issue participate in the groundwater management discussions that are upcoming, and that you hold your public officials accountable for managing that basin, because the groundwater is our last line of defense for reliability. After the Bay Delta fails or does not get done, all we have is Diamond Valley, and all we're going to have is the San Gabriel Basin. So it's going to take participation, it's going to take engagement, and That's what we need to do. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Excellent timing, everyone. We now have approximately 15 minutes for questions. We have two people here with microphones, one on each side. Hold your hand up so they can identify you, and I'll switch from side to side. Gar has someone over here.
Yes, didn't they just settle being able to store water from the central after the Calderon FBI investigation? Aren't they able to store water now there even that they weren't able to even store over this fighting?
Somebody's probably better addressing this question, but the Water Replenishment District recharges the basin to prevent or control the water intrusion into the central basin. That community off the harbor and the Long Beach freeways is at ground level. And what they're doing now is that the central basin metropolitan member would not sell replenishment water to replenishment district. And replenishment district had to go recharge the basins and do recycled water and grab whatever they could to put that to keep the saltwater intrusion from entering the South Bay, Torrance, Hawthorne area. And what you read in the paper is that given they've gotten past the moment with the Calderons, that the agencies are now in a more cooperative stance, and Central Basin is now selling water to the replenishment district so they can maintain the recharge and keep the saltwater intrusion from contaminating their pool of water.
This for Heather, Ms. Williams. Could you give us an update on what's happening with the Santa Ana River, Underground River, in your book?
Oh, thanks. Thank you. Nice plug. Yeah, I am on leave this year, and I am in the middle of writing a book called The River Underground, The Secret Life of the Santa Ana. And I'll just say a couple of words about it. I call it River Underground for two reasons, in part because a lot of the river's flow is underground, and it also it's really critical to the groundwater basins that make a lot of our water systems possible from in 3 counties, well, actually parts of 4. But also because this is also an above-ground river that people don't know about. And so it's a river that's there, but also out of sight. And so I want to argue that there's something about the architecture of our suburbs and the big box stores and the freeways and all the rest of it that invite us to think that we could just be anywhere rather than in a real place in the earth where rivers run through it and there are mountains and basins. And so it's looking at the history of how the river actually built the Inland Empire and how it taught us to think about water or not think about water. That's where the book is at. Thank you.
There's been a lot of focus on north-south, understandably, but I wonder if you could also comment on the activity out to the east of us with the Colorado River and the water transfers that have taken place in the last 20 years or so with Imperial Irrigation District and the Palo Verde Irrigation District, where about 3/4 or something like that of the water is used for agriculture. That is of our Colorado River 4.4 million acre feet per year allocation.
Again, I'm not an expert on the Colorado River, the law of the river. It's incredibly complex. I did participate as a member on the committee that negotiated the quantification settlement agreement, which resulted in the transfer of water from IID. Historically, there's 4.5 million acre feet coming to California from the lower half. 80% of that water goes to IID because they were first in time. They're back there in the 1870s, and they were digging ditches and getting the water. Once you built the Hoover and Parker Dam system, they had the first grab of water because they were already using enormous amounts of water. So they have the largest take, 3.1. The next take is Coachella at 550 or 650, and then Metropolitan had another 600,000 acre-feet of water, like 10% of what they were taking. What happened in the QSA is that, and this is another dark story, is that the people in Imperial, realizing the value of water then and today, began taking every drop of their water. We had one gentleman, John Allen, Dick Rich, remember him? From Imperial, onion farmer. He came to a meeting where we're negotiating this thing, and he put his foot in his mouth. He's passed away now, but he put his foot in his mouth. Nice gentleman, onion farmer, and he told the crowd, the audience, he was proud, said, that's our water, and I put 12 feet of water on my ground, and I get 4 turns of onions in 1 year, instead of 4 harvests of onions. And but the fact of the story was that the creation of the Salton Sea was an accident of nature. The river ran its banks before there was any control or any management, and the water turned clockwise and went to a sinkhole, created the Salton Sea. Ordinarily, over time, that sea would have simply evaporated like it did the last 10,000 years, and it would have disappeared. But the fact that the Salton Sea even existed after 1905 was evidence that we used in the litigation against Imperial on we call their water waste. There was 300,000 or 400,000 acre-feet of water draining into the Salton Sea, keeping it alive. We said, you're wasting the water. We took them to federal court, and the case settled. We developed the quantification settlement agreement, and Imperial agreed in that settlement that they would take 300,000 acre-feet of water that they were throwing on their ground for their farmers, would now be transferred to San Diego. It's a very convoluted deal because they did not follow the cascading succession that's in the established law of the river. It took a hopscotch. They hopped over Imperial, they hopped over Metropolitan. The water went directly to San Diego. That program has been ramping up, and they're, by I think 2017, in 3 more years, they're going to be at full ramp up with that water moving to San Diego, which means not a drop of water is going to come into the Salton Sea because there won't be the drainage of the new river going into the Salton Sea to keep it alive. I happen to be working on a project to try to, I'm being presumptuous here, save the Salton Sea, and I've talked with people here about it, and that's a totally different subject here, but the water did move from Imperial under the agreement in the federal lawsuit where they reduced their rights from 3.1 down to 2.8 million. I should say this for you and probably start a fight if the Imperial people were here, but our scientists and our consultants, the team put together by Jeff Keitlinger, who was then general counsel and my boss, and now the general manager of Metropolitan, we had put a team together, agronomists, economists, hydrologists, incredible people all over the country, and we could establish a best case on our part that proved that Imperial could operate their agriculture, have their productivity with as little as 2.4 million acre-feet of water. So there's still close to 500,000 acre-feet, I would say, on the table. Not for me, because I'll be dead, but in 30, 40 years, my children and grandchildren are going to have to look at the question of how Imperial uses their water. I don't mean to attack them, but if you look at Coachella and San Joaquin compared to Imperial, in Imperial, you go out there, and I live out there part-time. You don't see that in Coachella. Coachella has high-value crops, and like my home in La Quinta, drip irrigation, the most efficient in the world, and they're very productive. At somewhere down the line, we've got to get Imperial thinking, like we've got to get the people in the north thinking, get past the common law, get past the idea that it's my property. No, it's my state, it's your state, and that water belongs to all of us. So we've taken that first step, but I don't expect to see a second step for another 30 or 40 years, maybe sooner if conditions stay bad. But that is the first time transfer. We're very fortunate to have it. Imperial can do without it, and they can probably do with even less water. But when the political will comes to make that move, then we'll have to do it because the population of the state will be growing.
Yeah, I'm aware that Peter Glick is still in the audience, and I'm extremely curious to know what his reaction to the Bay Delta plan is, because I believe he's probably one of the most knowledgeable persons in the room that could comment on that. So I wonder if he might be able to respond briefly Do we need 2 tunnels? Do we need 1 tunnel? What do we need in terms of solving the delta problems without going into a long dissertation? And is the current drought plan a step in the right direction?
Well, I'll do this in a minute. We need to fix the Bay Delta. And I wrote this in an op-ed that was published in the Sacramento Bee a year or so ago. Until somebody tells me, and the talk about this was very good, until somebody tells me how big the tunnels are really going to be, how much water is going to be delivered, who's going to decide how much water is going to be delivered, where that water is going to go, who's going to pay for it, I find it very difficult to have an opinion. There are questions that have not yet been answered about control and design and building. And so I've sort of punted on that question, and I fall back on look, there are all these other things that we know we can do now in terms of efficiency improvements, in terms of all sorts of things that I already talked about, that are far cheaper and that will actually have an effect not 30 years from now, but now.
Thank you.
My name is Mel Boynton, and my question from my favorite theory of politics, which is follow the money. Would you name some of the major moneyed powers on various sides of this argument of the future of California water? Who are the big money players we should keep our eye on?
Well, I don't know if you could identify individuals. I mean, California has an enormous ag industry. We're the blessing of the planet. We feed half the planet already. So you've got ag. We've got high-tech Silicon Valley and other places, big, heavy water users. I mean, we all carry little cell phones here, so we're all part of the problem. I don't think it's the right question to say, of course you do follow the money. I don't know if that's the right question to ask. The question is, it should be, do we have the leadership willing to take on rigid points of view to find a greater good? When you look at the Bay Delta, in 1982 when they voted it, it was a mistake. It took water and moved it. It did nothing for what was in the Bay Delta. And if you look at the system as been described here, they've got these enormous pumps, 12,000 horsepower electric motors pumping 20-foot diameter. You could drive a Greyhound bus loaded on top through these barrels. And when the pumps are on, it's a freak against nature. It is sucking all the water from Sassoon and reversing the flows against nature. If we were to do the right thing, build, as been described here, build a peripheral canal that goes around and doesn't disturb it to get the water right in front of the pumps, so they're pumping from a forebay and not sucking 20 miles upstream to reverse the flow of water against nature and confusing the fish and mixing salinity with fresh water at the wrong time. If we built the right kind of conveyance to serve Southern California and our needs, you could engineer, and I'm sure they're talking about this, little spigots or turnouts that could flush the delta at any one of several points to help restore the natural flow when they need it for the smelt and the environment of the bay and the whole estuary. That historically goes back and forth. I've been told after a heavy snow melt in April or May, I was told, I don't know if it's true or not, I was told by an engineer, Henry, there's so much water running under San Francisco Golden Gate, you can put a cup in the water and taste fresh water. Is that right, Ken? At the Golden Gate Bridge in the middle of April or May on a good snowpack year. The point is that we don't capture all the water that we could in the first place. We capture 20, 25, 30% of the water that runs to the sea. A properly designed Bay Delta would bring the water to the south, not interfere with the natural flow of the estuary, and provide water for flushing to restore and maintain the natural conditions that the estuary has had for thousands and thousands of years. That's what we need to do.
We have time for one more question. Sorry. All right. The deadlines for public comments on both the plan and the EIR has been extended until June 13th of this year.
So
So
a month
it's-
and a half longer than.
It's only
April
about
14th.
10,000 pages, but don't worry about it. There's plenty of time
Thank you for
now.
that clarification.
One issue from the Department of Water and Power, LA City. They've been using around 600,000 acre feet a year for almost 20 years. And the population has increased considerably because they're starting to recycle and reuse their water. What would you consider to be a reasonable recycled, treated wastewater approach for the San Gabriel Valley? Because we're looking at only 30 to 40,000 acre feet up in the San Joaquin Valley, the San Fernando Valley. So what's the opportunity here in San Gabriel for recycled wastewater reuse for the groundwater?
If you'll allow me to not answer your question directly, but more obliquely, a comment that I did not include in the paper that I overlooked in presenting here, when I talked about the culture between the North and South, they got lots of water, here we're bone dry. I think the numbers are still valid because I heard it this morning again. The average unmetered in the North, unmetered water is about 320 gallons per person per day in the North. And the North is anywhere like north of Tracy, I guess. That's where the pumps are. The water consumption in San Francisco is 170 gallons per person a day, almost half. The water consumption in Southern California, the Los Angeles area, is 120 gallons per person. Yeah, that's us. So we're already doing a job that's not marketed enough or branded enough. We do a lot in Southern California out of necessity because we're sitting in the desert, and this is a desert like Cairo, Egypt, same climate, same conditions. So we've got that sensitivity. We've done a lot already. So your question is more technical than I can answer. I'm trying to give you an answer in perspective. We use 120 gallons per person. In the North, it's 320 or 340. In San Francisco, midlines, 170 gallons. So we're doing a lot already. There's more we can do, primarily in managing the groundwater basin. The San Gabriel Basin is a blessing from heaven. It's magnificent. It's got potential we've not begun to tap. And even with the pollution from Aerojet and the Water Quality Authority doing their job to clean the pockets of hot stuff along the river, there's a lot more potential to store water when it's available. So that's my answer.
Okay, thanks.